I know we have to all squeeze in here. It's an impressive room. If you weren't in here before when I mentioned it, please go ahead and start your lunch. Hello. Hi. What great energy in this room, and I truly hate to quieten it down, but that's my job. So I have a couple of housekeeping items, and you'll want to know this, I guarantee you. One, we found a phone. It's been turned in at the registration desk, so if you've lost your phone, please stop by there and pick it up. The second, and this is going to be very important, people have been asking for the passcode, the password for the internet. It is Walking, all apps, 2017. Walking 2017, all apps. So if you haven't logged on to the America Walks internet, you can do that now. And of course, make sure you're looking at your Walking Summit app because you'll get many good updates. This morning, all right, this morning when we met, there was one group that I wanted to mention that we didn't have time to mention, and I'd like to do that now if I could. Let's see if we can get the people in the room here. Many of us who've been at this for decades are really interested in and concerned about the pipeline that's coming behind us and making sure that there are young people learning the skills and the history that will keep our work moving forward. One of the ways that we do that at America Walks is with a Walking College Fellowship. And this year, I'm happy to say, we have just graduating, if you will, 24 Walking College Fellows from around the country. And if I could get them to raise their hand so you'll see them here. If you have an opportunity, and they're wearing a ribbon that says Walking College Fellow, if you have an opportunity, talk to them. They have all been working hard over the last 6 months to develop a walking action plan for their communities, and I'm sure they will have some amazing questions for you. And when you hear the sort of creative ideas they're putting forward, it'll give you a great deal of confidence anyway. We have an amazing panel that's going to come up in a few minutes and talk to you about walking and walkability from multiple perspectives. But before that, we want to continue a tradition that started at the 2015 Walking Summit when the American College of Sports Medicine gave out their first Everybody Walk Clinician Award, and I'm here today to say that we're about to award the second one. So would you welcome Jim Whitehead, the CEO of American College of Sports Medicine, to introduce us to the second clinical award.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank all of you for your leadership and for being part of this conference. You know, you can't see the perspective, but I'm looking at a room of innovators and disruptors for social good and for betterment of health for all. So we're about to recognize one person for a particular role, but you all deserve recognition for the leadership and the change that you're driving. We appreciate it very, very much. Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. It always seems impossible until it's done. Well, we're not done yet, but each of you, and collectively, are making extraordinary historic transformation occur. That's what you're doing here. You're not attending a conference, and you may be eating lunch, but that's not all that you're doing. You truly are making change happen in historic and meaningful ways. So what I'm about to do in regard to recognizing one individual, a healthcare provider who has made such a difference in using walking in his practice, you all are applying that in your lives and what you're doing and by your being at this conference. The American College of Sports Medicine, it's the largest sports medicine exercise science organization in the world, has been focused for decades on the science and practice of physical activity and its many benefits. This has included walking early on walking. We did a roundtable, we did all kinds of things that began to focus on this. And fast forward, it is amazing where this movement has gone. It's science-based, it's very practical, and it's just grown enormously, again, thanks to your leadership. Well, healthcare providers and other clinicians are a key professional group, as you all are. What we're wanting to do is to encourage, and we are beginning to see this in regard to healthcare, where walking is understood as being this accessible, affordable way for walking, wheelchair rolling, communities that support each, and they're incorporating that into their practice, into how they talk with their patients, of how they have success with their patients. So we created this annual Walks the Walk Outstanding Clinician Award. And the award is designed, again, to acknowledge clinicians, healthcare providers who have really integrated walking consultation into their assessments, into their practice, and the conversations that they have with patients, many of whom, when they're talking with their patients, they accompany their patients on a walk, or they accompany their patients in wheelchair rolling. I mean, they're incorporating that into how they define and conduct health care. So the Outstanding Clinician Award is unique, and it recognizes a clinician who demonstrates excellence with walking in three key categories: clinical care, obviously, patient support, really making sure that the patient can incorporate it, understands the importance, and so forth, and just leadership, just flat out leadership of making a commitment to walking in patient health. So all of this is very high in regard to the priorities and so forth, and we're looking for people who really make a difference in their lives to their patients through walking and their counseling about walking. And so it is, the individual is not with us today, had a long-standing commitment and conflict, but it is with great pleasure that I shared that this year's Walks the Walk Outstanding Clinician Award to Dr. David Fletcher with the Indiana University Health Center. David has a long-standing commitment today, as I said, and not with us, but just a few words about him. He's a primary care physician. He's created all kinds of medical institutes within that center, and he has always felt, early part of his clinical practice, that walking has become a key. It is a key to patient health. It is a key. He sees students, obviously, at IU, Indiana University, but he also sees an array of patients across the lifespan. For him, walking has become central in regard to reaching the patient, helping the patient, and so forth. So he has made this part of his practice, and I just want us, if you don't mind in absentia, to give him recognition for what he does as being a healthcare provider incorporating walking. Thank you very much, and I'll share that with David. So long-term leadership there, we're really focused on getting more and more healthcare providers to do just this thing, to complement the great work and to support the great work that you do. So David is one champion among healthcare providers. There are many more. It's growing. And of course, this is a room of champions as well. Just in closing, there's a saying, show me your heroes, identify your heroes, and you'll be able to see the future. Well, you together all are defining and shaping an extraordinary future, and to that we're greatly indebted to each of you, to all of you, and the better future that we're making together. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Jim. I guess I shouldn't have gone to sit back down. That was too far. One of the things that we wanted to do, if you'll just indulge us for a moment, is just to take a pause and send some good wishes and warm thoughts to our colleagues and friends in Texas and Florida. Surprisingly enough, many of them were able to make it and join us today, or yesterday and today, but our thoughts have been with them, and as they have to rebuild, we hope they will be there to offer support as they're going through that. So if we could just have a moment to recognize them quietly, that would be great. I'm sure that's going to be felt in Texas and Florida. Now, I get the honor of introducing to you Anika Ward. Anika is the director of the Center for Prevention, which is the part of Blue Cross Blue Shield Minnesota that we have worked with and has headed up our local host committee here in the Twin Cities. Anika has a long history of working on collaboration and partnerships to really improve outcomes for families and youth. Some of you may know her because she worked at the Science Museum of Minnesota, I think here in St. Paul, and she recently worked at the governor's office recruiting all of the great people that work in your state government. So with that, Anika, would you please come up?
Good afternoon. I'm Anika Ward. I'm director for the Center for Prevention at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Minnesota, where our mission is to make healthy choices possible for all Minnesotans. We are proud to be a part of bringing the Walking Summit here to St. Paul. We work in partnership with organizations all over the state of Minnesota to advance health equity, transform communities, and create a healthier state. I'm happy you've seen or will see some of our partnerships in action throughout this conference. For example, community engagement and advocacy work to make the Dale Street Bridge in St. Paul, my hometown, better for people who use the sidewalks. Experiencing 29th Street, the first shared street in Minneapolis. The plans for converting a low-traffic street to a greenway in North Minneapolis. The impact of complete streets on a main thoroughfare in Alexandria, Minnesota. And positive changes that are resulting from safe routes to school efforts throughout our state. Now, before I introduce Tamika Butler, who I am so excited will be facilitating this important panel discussion today, I'd like to do a quick thanks to America Walks for bringing this opportunity to Minnesota, the local host committee, and all of the presenters who are sharing their insights and sparking conversations. And then especially to all of you for being here to support healthy and equitable communities. So let me introduce Tamika. She's a tireless leader in social justice, working to fight racism, inequality, poverty, and injustice. She speaks nationally in rooms such as this one to help audiences understand the powerful intersections of our environments, our streets and parks and sidewalks, with our communities, the structures and systems of power that affect us, and our health. In addition to being a master storyteller, she is the executive director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, a nonprofit organization that addresses social and racial equity and wellness by building parks and gardens in park-poor communities across greater Los Angeles. Before this, Tamika was the executive director of the Los Angeles Community Bicycle Coalition, County Bicycle Coalition, working in partnership with the Los Angeles Vision Zero Alliance to develop a united constituency for safe and equitable streets. Please help me welcome Tamika.
Good afternoon, everybody. The first thing I want to do, because I have a mic, and you should never give people mics without a plan, is say congratulations to one of my dear friends, Amelia, who is here in the front of the room. Amelia was just named Executive Director of Los Angeles Walks. And the other reason you should all know who Amelia is, particularly you white folks, is because Amelia is really, really great at knowing when to step up and step back, and has been one of the folks in our coalition in LA who has seen the mental and emotional toll that this work and being in these kinds of rooms takes on people of color. And she is the person who, when white people wow out, we're like, you gotta go talk to Amelia because we just can't handle it anymore. And she graciously takes that on. And so I know she's gonna be a wonderful leader for Los Angeles Walks. She's already been an amazing leader. So congratulations to you, Amelia. Let's give her a round of applause. So I was asked to come here to talk and moderate a panel on how equity and social justice fit into the walking movement. And I'm really, really excited to have three wonderful panelists who are gonna do most of the talking, folks whose work I admire. And I'm just gonna briefly set the stage, and then we'll bring them on stage, and then we'll talk for a while, and then hopefully leave plenty of times for questions from the crowd. But in setting the stage, you know, when I was coming to Minnesota, St. Paul, it's hard for us out-of-towners. Are we in Minneapolis? Are we in St. Paul? What's happening? But when I was coming to Minnesota and getting really excited about long O's in every word, I was trying to think of how could I set the stage for how equity and social justice fit into walking? I've never been a walking advocate. I've been at the Bike Coalition. I've been a transportation advocate. And as my good friend Adonia was saying, I think in the bike world often, as bike folks, we say biking and walking, but that's pretty much it. Like, that's where we stop. And we know we need to be better at it, but what does it really mean for me to tell stories? What do I know about being a walking advocate? And what I do know is what it's like to walk in this country as a Black person. And I know what it's like to walk into rooms like this, where when I look out, I see a lot of innovators and leaders, but I also see a lot of white people. And like right now in America, if you're not a white person, you just don't know who to trust. You never know what people are thinking, what they're gonna say. That's particularly true in California, at least when I'm back home in the Midwest. I'm from Nebraska. I feel like I have a little bit better sense, like when all of my parents' neighbors have their flags out and they let you know who they are, but are so friendly. I have a better sense. But I feel like when you think about social justice or when you think about equity in the walking movement or in any movement, what really scares me lately is that they're just words and that they don't really mean anything to people, because it's just becoming so sexy to say equity, and it's just becoming so sexy to say social justice. But what are folks actually doing to be allies, and beyond that, to be accomplices for the folks who need you the most? My wife and I, and for many folks who follow my speeches, they know this is usually the point where I put up a picture of a beautiful white woman who's my wife. And we were in couples therapy earlier this week, and we were talking about dismantling white supremacy in our relationship. It was a very easy hour. And something we talked about was, how do white folks not just make room for people of color, not just listen to people of color, but how do you realize that every single day we're inherently at risk because of the color of our skin, because what country we may be from, or what country people may think we're from, because of what religion we hold, or what religion people may assume we hold. And so we were talking about if therapy didn't go well, and we decided to leave therapy and walk down the street of Pasadena, California, a super walkable neighborhood, and we started arguing, and I was a Black woman who looks like a Black man, and I was yelling at this 120-pound soaking wet white woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, how would anyone else interpret that situation? And then we started talking about all the times we have been walking down the street together, and all the times that she sees people cross the street to get away from me, or she sees people who we walk past hold their purse a little tighter, or she's had people say, "Are you okay? That person's following you very closely." Well, yes, I sometimes also sleep with her. Sometimes on the couch, sometimes with her. And so for folks of color who are thinking about how to make social justice or equity part of the walking movement, it's not something that we can intellectually masturbate about, because we have to live it. We have to understand that whether or not we're walking, or biking, or in our car, we are who we are in this world. And we can't, and we no longer have the patience, and we no longer have the time to wait for people who have privilege and for people to have power to figure out what that means for us. Because all we've heard lately is equity is important, social justice is important, protecting dreamers is important. If you work hard and if you respect other people, then they'll respect you too. But all of those statements are statements born in privilege. Because when you're folks of color, or when you're trans, or when you're Native, and you realize that before the street was even there, this was your land, but now people are treating you like you don't belong there? When you're in one of those groups, and you keep having people say to you, well, if you just treat people with respect, well, if you just understand how policy works, well, if you just come to these community engagement meetings, well, if it gets really bad, then we'll help. Well, it's just not my fight to fight. I'm a walking advocate. I don't really do that. When we keep hearing that over and over, and it's always followed by a but when this happens, I'll be there. We don't believe you because you haven't been there. I had a staff meeting the other day when one of our staff members who has DACA, and we were talking about what it means and what's happening in the country, and one of the people on my staff said, what is it going to take for things to change? What is it going to take for everybody to have the same vision of us and care about equity and care about social justice? I'm just really worried we're going to have to go to war before anybody figures it out. And what I said as a military kid is, war won't help. Because just like everything else, my father, who grew up in the projects of Omaha, Nebraska, and joined the military so that we could get off food stamps, so that we can have a better life, if we go to war, you're still going to send black and brown people to the front line to die. So until, again, folks with power and privilege are willing to put it on the line, on the front lines, then what's going to change? And what we have to start thinking about and what we want to do in this panel is, what does that look like? What are the things you have to be thinking about to put it on the line? Because whether or not it's a war, or whether or not it's military service, or advocacy, our folks of color are working double, triple, quadruple shifts. We're trying to be polite to white people. We're trying to stay sane, and we're trying to do good work for our communities. And for us to start believing that social justice and equity are more than sexy lunchtime panels, we need to know that folks are in this fight with us, not just as allies, but as accomplices, that you are willing to do what it takes, and sometimes knowing that doing what it takes is shutting the hell up and letting other people who know what to do what it takes, and supporting us in the way that we ask for support. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And that makes a lot of people wonder, well, what do I do? And it makes a lot of people feel guilty. Well, I'm not racist. I would have never gone to Charlottesville with a tiki torch from Oriental Trading Company. I don't even say Oriental anymore. But instead of focusing on that guilt and focusing on all the things you don't do, what we hope you leave with after this panel is thinking about the things you will do. Because we don't really have time to hear what you don't do. We don't really have time to hear that you didn't have slaves. We don't really have time to hear that your housekeeper is undocumented and you love her just the same. What we want is to know, what are you actually going to do? How are you going to be brave? How are you going to speak up? And how are you going to get to the point where when you look around the room and there are certain groups not represented, you think it's a problem, not you don't even notice. Because I guarantee that the second you stop noticing is the second that we start disappearing. And the unfortunate thing for so many of us is that we know we've already started to disappear. And so I do want to bring up the panelists. And again, as we go through this uplifting panel conversation, we just ask that you think critically and that you push yourself, because the title of the panel, the people who have great power are you all. I understand I have a certain level of privilege, I have a certain level of power, but we need folks with power to realize that your responsibility is to give some of that shit up. So panelists, if you'll join me, let's start talking about how to give some of that shit up. So as our panelists meet each other, in person, we've had many phone calls. I'm a millennial, so I'm going to be reading my notes off my cell phone. Don't judge me, and don't tell my mother. So I want to first start by just telling you, a little bit about the people who I'm introducing. But I'm going to let them start off with a little bit of a self-introduction of themselves and answering one question. So we'll start with Adonia. And Adonia is, and my cell phone saved as Dr. Adonia. She's one of the first people I met in the active transportation movement. She has spent time building up things in LA, like Ciclavia, like Multicultural Communities for Mobility. She's been on the national scene at the League, and she is an amazing scholar and just thought leader in the field about so many things around equity, social justice, and frankly, what it means to talk the talk and walk the walk. And so, Adonia, you can share more about yourself, but my first question to you is also, the panel's called "With Great Power Comes Great Responsibility," the role of the walking movement in promoting equity and social justice. Tell us about how you see power and privilege playing out in the walking movement, the active transportation movement, and what that means for equity and social justice.
So, to answer now?
Yeah.
This isn't on, right? Hello? How about now? No. Nope. Oh, I think possibly? Yes. Hello. So, yes, I'm Dr. Adonia Lugo. I'm a cultural anthropologist who has had the unusual trajectory of studying racial inclusion in bicycle advocacy in particular for about the last 9 years now. And questions about power are interesting ones in social movements like the bike movement, like the walking movement, the environmental movement, where people are coming together because they don't feel powerful. They're coming together because they recognize something that is big and important and pressing and urgent. And it's like, how come nobody else is freaking out over this thing? You know, when you become an activist in one of these spaces, it's because you've had that experience of, oh my gosh, somebody needs to do something. I'm a person, I'm gonna do some stuff related to improving, whatever the issue is that you're working on. And I'm one of those people. I started studying bicycling not because I thought it would be interesting or there weren't very many anthropologists looking at that, which there aren't. I started studying bicycling because I was a bicycle commuter, and I had become a bicycle commuter in Portland, Oregon, where I went to college. And when I moved home to Southern California in 2007 to start my PhD, it was really scary to be a bike commuter there in a way I had not experienced in my years riding a bicycle in Portland. And the more that I fixated on why it was scary and why I was getting treated like I was doing something wrong at a time when we need to be putting so much effort and resources toward actually reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. And, this bicycle thing seemed like such a easy, straightforward way to do that. And yet the way people were interacting with me on streets said that I was doing something wrong. Well, the more I thought about that, I'm a pretty stubborn person, and so I didn't decide to stop so that I would fit in more. I decided to dig in and figure out what was going on. And there seemed to be some kind of relationship between how you were traveling in Southern California, so whether you were inside of a car or not, and what you looked like, how much money you made. All of these things were all mixed up together in this tangle where, if you could afford to drive, you were supposed to drive. You were not supposed to be riding the bus, walking, riding a bicycle. Those things were for those other people who couldn't afford to drive. There was a very hard, rigid line, and as, a woman of color who had spent the last 6 years up in a ecotopian, wonderland that Portland is, coming back to Southern California and being like, but getting around without a car is like really fun and cool. That's like what we do. That's what we should all be doing, right? I went through this really strong clash of values and had to start developing some self-awareness about my own culture that I'm from. I got my own car when I was 17. Didn't think twice about riding the bus anymore. Why would I do that once I had access to a car? And so somehow I had gone through a transformation process unconsciously in the years that I'd been living in Portland. And so I knew in 2007, once this stuff started really taking over my thoughts, I was going to do a PhD project on something else entirely. I figured maybe I should dig a little deeper and try and figure out what was going on. And once I started looking at, okay, so what makes a street feel the way it does? Why does it have the shape that it does? What's going on there? I learned that there was this whole field of bicycle advocacy. There were people who had been organizing for years and talking to each other and sharing strategies, and they had certain ideas about what the problems were with our streets and what needed to change. And so that's how I embarked on not really just looking at how do you promote bicycling or active transportation, sustainable transportation modes, but who are the people who are promoting those modes, and what is their movement culture like, and what are the things that they kind of take for granted that everybody in the room kind of shares as a value or shares as a starting point, and what is left outside of that. Because one thing that I learned as I got engaged with bicycle advocacy is that people who look like me usually don't get engaged with bicycle advocacy. And, I'm a white person in disguise. I'm a mixed race person raised by my white mom. And so I have a lot of, I have a chameleon-like ability in some ways to feel very at home in spaces where I'm the only person of color. And as I got involved in bicycle advocacy and started finding myself in those spaces more and more, this really weird thing happened where I was participating in a space that didn't have a lot of diversity at the same time that I was developing into an expert on diversity in that space. So it's been kind of a weird few years for me. It's actually, this is, I think, my first time speaking to a national audience about active transportation for about 3 years, because I ended up having to withdraw from bicycle advocacy for a while because it just got to be too hard to be the person who's different and tells everybody about what it's like to be different. So it's good to be here, but there is power in the room, And the way that power functions in this kind of space can be hard to see because, again, there is that sense of being the underdog. There is that sense of nobody else is working on this. We have so much work to do. So developing self-awareness about where one's own power comes from and what one's starting points are with, the vision that you have for what our streets should be like or what safety should be like is tremendously important to building collective power. The more that we know as individuals where our power is and where our power isn't, the better job we're going to be able to do to organize into something bigger.
Thank you, Adonia. And, I think what you said resonates with me so much because I think oftentimes we get into this narrative that having power and being powerless are mutually exclusive. And I actually think that there are many people who can feel powerless, but it doesn't mean that you don't have power. And we might sometimes say that to low-income communities of color, like you might feel powerless right now, but the power is in the community. But I think it's also something important for, our white accomplices to think about, that sometimes you're in those spaces where you feel like people are just hitting you hard and like, oh, colonizer, oh, Christopher Columbus, oh, whatever it may be, and you may feel powerless, but that doesn't mean, like you said, Adonia, that you don't have to question why you're feeling that guilt, and that the fact that you feel powerless doesn't somehow mean that you still don't have the power, and you have to be really thoughtful about how you're using or abusing that power. And so, Brian, I wanna go to you. When I first got an email from Brian and I saw that he worked at this organization, PRAC, I was like, what is PRAC? And I went to the website and I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many cool things here about race, about housing, about intersectionality. So can you tell folks a little bit about yourself, the mission, your organization's mission as a civil rights organization that confronts structural racism in housing and education, and how does that mission and work tie into walkability or walkable neighborhoods and the goals of walking advocates?
Yep. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm Brian Knutson. I'm the research associate at PRAC, Poverty and Race Research Action Council, which is in DC. And to your question, I think the thing I'd start out by saying is that fair housing advocates and walkability advocates should interface and should collaborate more than we've done so far, which might be not very much at all. And that there are real possibilities and benefits and gains to doing this, but also some possible costs from not doing this. So yeah, I think I'll just start by talking a bit, motivating that by talking a bit about PRAC and what we do, and then linking to walking towards the end there. So PRAC is a civil rights organization. We take an integrationist approach in our commitment to confronting structural racism in housing and education. This means kind of using housing policy to address concentrated poverty and segregation, and to provide folks access to resources and opportunities and high opportunity neighborhoods. And so we believe that housing policy is an access point to other social resources like jobs and transportation and good schools and public health. And this is sort of based on or foundationed upon decades now of research that explores the sort of impacts of segregation and concentrated poverty, especially on children. And this was mentioned this morning, I think, by Glenn Harris, right? The lower life expectancy, lower educational attainment, even health, impacts from toxic stress, and then the new sort of powerful research from Raj Chetty at Stanford, where his team has sort of monetized the benefits to low-income families and children to moving to higher opportunity neighborhoods. So housing policy and educational policy, from our perspective, should be geared toward these things, desegregating and deconcentrating poverty and giving people of color and the poor access to opportunities. So I'll just give you one quick example of how this is playing out in our recent work and then link to the walking a bit. So one thing that we're doing at present is some technical assistance, giving technical assistance to public housing authorities and other local fair housing groups in several highly segregated cities to set up what are called housing mobility programs. And sort of at the most general level, what these programs are supposed to do is assist or help Section 8 voucher holders better use their vouchers to reach these higher opportunity neighborhoods, right? And this is necessary because we find that in many places, vouchers are still concentrated in high poverty neighborhoods, even though one of the rationales for Section 8 tenant-based vouchers was to deconcentrate poverty, but it hasn't worked out that way, right? So Baltimore, for instance, has a highly successful housing mobility program, and what they do is provide a kind of suite of services like pre- and post-move counseling to sort of voucher holders, guidance as to possible location, neighborhoods or locations, landlord outreach, and the like. And PRAC, given our sort of fair housing advocacy and our interest in integration, is very deeply involved in these kinds of efforts. So that's a bit of background as to what we do. And then what about the walking piece? Well, I think it comes in perhaps from this notion of access. So for instance, could our understanding of these opportunity neighborhoods that I was just talking about incorporate walkability components, especially if one of the benefits of walkable locales is accessibility to resources, arising from proximity and connectivity and pedestrian access. Sort of furthermore, to what extent could access itself be understood as a matter of sort of spatial access or spatial proximity, abetted or aided by walkable urban forms? So that's one possible point of overlap as I was thinking about it. So this would really be the question of sort of to what extent can we more closely couple the underlying concerns of groups like ours, fair housing, and advocates and walkability advocates, given that these two domains have been operating kind of separate from one another. It's a question about, first, the types of factors that are taken into account by fair housing advocates as we think about what we do, making fair and affordable housing increasingly available to low-income people and people of color in the higher opportunity neighborhoods, and whether and how to incorporate walkability given those profound benefits from proximity. But second, I think it's also a question of the reverse, which is whether and exactly how walking advocates incorporate fair housing into their work, right? And developing an understanding of the consequences, I'd say, of not doing that, which would include, of course, sort of displacement and gentrification, but certainly from our fair housing perspective also, the further concentration of low-income people in high poverty or racially concentrated, but perhaps walkable neighborhoods, which is not something that we'd seek. So I think I'll offer that the answer should be yes, that there definitely needs to be a kind of closer relationship, a closer coupling, but that the devil is going to be in the details in how we carry that out, right? And just to preview, from my fair housing perspective, we emphasize the need to always sort of retain a fair housing overlay in any kind of conversation that we're having about this. So I think that's how I'll start.
Thanks, Brian. I think there's a lot that you said around displacement and gentrification and how fair housing overlaps with access and walkability, and really bringing this intersectional lens to the work. And it's really great to hear from somebody completely out of the space about how they see walkability. Having Adonia, who is perhaps more of a traditional active transportation advocate, and now we have Kathy to really liven up the post-lunch crowd. You have the job we all kind of want, right? You're the program officer for creative placemaking. So what does that mean? And what does creativity and art have to do with social justice, with walkability, with placemaking of any kind?
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Kathy Muchapal, and I'm with Twin Cities LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation. I am the program officer for creative placemaking. And you know, when Kate asked me to be on this panel, I was like, are you sure? I'm not a walking advocate. I don't, you know, like, I appreciate walking. You know, we talk about, you know, infrastructure with my partners, but I'm not a walking advocate. So when I saw this question, what does it mean? You know, somewhere, wherever my mom is, she really appreciates this question as well, because she's always asking me, what do you do? And then having to explain it in Hmong is even more challenging. So creative placemaking is about people coming together to make positive changes in physical, economic, and social impacts in neighborhoods through arts and culture, right? And we value art as an expression of culture, and culture as an expression of people in the communities that we work in. So I'm Hmong American. There's no Hmong word for art. And being an arts administrator and working in the arts, you know, for a long time that really bothered me, because I was really thinking about art through a Western concept, right? I'm American born, I was grown here, English is my first language. But, you know, I started to wonder, like, do we not have self-expression? You know, are we not creative people? And, you know, the more I started to think and learn about my own culture and the concept and the possibility of art, and really going outside of just the Western concept of capital A fine arts, right? And understanding it as an expression of culture, and thinking about what culture means for people and communities, and really that is the soul of a person, right? And a community. So, you know, that's the way we think, talk, and do creative placemaking at LISC. So, you know, the technical, the kind of like, what do I do on a day-to-day basis? So I work with non-arts organizations, primarily non-arts organizations, to really help them develop arts and cultural strategies for economic development in the Twin Cities, in St. Paul and Minneapolis. And yes, we are in St. Paul. Across the river is Minneapolis. Our cities are like fraternal twins. They're not identical twins. But I really encourage you, if you haven't gone on the Green Line yet, jump on the Green Line, go to Minneapolis, you know, walk around both downtowns, and you'll start to understand what the distinctions are. But I think to your question about what does art, culture, and creativity have to do with movements and social justice, I mean, everything that I've said already. So, you know, really working with our partners to, you know, there are really traditional ways of doing commercial corridor revitalization. You know, marketing, facade improvement, all these things are really important. And, you know, I think that the conversation around gentrification and displacement often is thought about through the economic displacement of people, and creative placemaking is a really powerful tool for preserving and really trying to protect and preserve the cultural identity of places as well. And so to prevent cultural displacement is really important. But I think that every movement, development, or action, you know, you really have to think about who's benefiting from this work, right? Who is benefiting, and also, you know, or even worse, who's harmed or displaced or oppressed. And so I think that creative placemaking or art-based community development is about empowering people to take control of their own narratives, to have agency in a place, and to be able to build relationships with each other so that they can really build the power to be a part of the change and not to be a victim of the change that's happening to them.
Thanks, Kathy. And so you know, just to try to make this a little bit more of a conversation, I think what you all said really really hit me and really touched me just on a personal level. I live in a neighborhood in Los Angeles, Leimert Park, that is a historically black neighborhood. It's actually used to be a Jewish neighborhood. After Japanese internment, it was one of the only neighborhoods Japanese families could live in, and then became an African-American kind of cultural jazz hub. And is still, at this point, predominantly African-American. And so when my wife and I were looking for homes, I said, you know, my kids have to grow up around black people. Like, it just can't not happen. So in LA, there's like 2 neighborhoods. And so, you know, South Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, where Leimert is, or this other neighborhood by Pasadena, Altadena, which was a neighborhood created for the servants of the rich people in Pasadena. So those were our choices, with all the culture and all the things that those neighborhoods held. And I remember when I first started at the Bike Coalition, my friends who were like super down in social justice and knew I used to be a civil rights lawyer, the most common thing I heard is like, how are you gonna work at a bike job? Bike lanes are the first sign of gentrification. Like, you're giving in to the man. And my thought is always, bike lanes are not the first sign of gentrification. White ladies walking is the first sign of gentrification. Like, and not like white ladies walking in the mall, because who doesn't do that? But like white ladies walking with like their cute little puppies and like their strollers. My wife doesn't have a stroller yet, but she definitely like has our cute little dog. And since we moved to this neighborhood, everyone who's moved in around us has looked more like my wife than me. And so I think as walking advocates, you know, oftentimes when we think of placemaking and when we think of gentrification and displacement, people often like, I'm an engine of gentrification, right? Like, I'm part of this group of people who's coming in with privilege, and you know, I learned that the person whose house we've moved into and painted the door turquoise, so everybody knows it's a new house with modern numbers out front. I learned that person was evicted because they had, you know, they had a loan that was not favorable, and so if I'm part of that problem, the question I always ask is, how do we get to the point where neighborhoods that become more walkable, right? That's what's pushing this in my neighborhood. There's a cute little, you know, Leimert Park Plaza with cute little stores. There's going to be a train line right there. There's a Kaiser Hospital that they just built. They're redoing the mall to be more of an outdoor space. And we have arts and culture in Leimert. And it's this beautiful coming together of people. But when you make neighborhoods more walkable, people often wonder in those neighborhoods, who is this walkability for, right? Like, as folks of color, like Adonia said, we've been walking. I walk to the bus stop, I walk to the grocery store, I walk my kid to school, I'm walking to work, I'm walking everywhere, right? Like, I'm relying on public transportation, I'm walking. I would always tell people in the bike world, you know, people of color invented bike share. Like, homie, let me borrow your bike for a minute, I'm gonna bring it right back. When folks say that folks of color aren't environmentalists, we've been growing our own food. Like, you will shut off the lights in my grandmother's house because she is not paying to light up the whole neighborhood, right? Like, we will save every reusable container at every store. We will get something to go just so we can have the container to use for later. And so when there's these communities who do care about the environment, who do care about sustainability, who do care about walkability, but it seems like no one cares about making that space more walkable until other people want to move in, and the work you all do, how do you help folks, to what Kathy said, feel like those changes are for them? That those changes are rooted in the culture and the things that they find important and not for other people.
Was that one question? There are so many things going on in my mind right now. I mean, you know, okay, so LISC is one of the largest creative placemaking, community development organizations in the country. You know, and we talk about helping places and people to prosper, right? And one of the things that happens, I mean, to your point, you know, like bike lanes being the first sign of gentrification, or making walkability and that displacing people. I mean, you know, poor people and people of color want nice things too, right? We want walkability, we want bike lanes. I mean, we do it anyways, right? But to your question earlier about the power piece, I mean, it's the people of power that can make it happen, right? And oftentimes that's not the poor people and the people of color. So there's just, it's not quite an answer to it. One of the things I'll say, so I live also in a predominantly African-American community in St. Paul, the Rondo neighborhood. And so if you get on the Green Line, go down to Western, Dale, Lexington, Victoria, that's my neighborhood there. On one side it's Rondo, on the other side it's Frogtown. But kind of the reverse of your neighborhood, you know, this was historically an African-American community that was destroyed by the development of I-94. Around the 70s, and then in about 76, 78 was the influx of Southeast Asian communities because of the Vietnam War. And so it was predominantly African American, destroyed, completely disinvested. Southeast Asian community comes in and purchases all these kind of like disinvested and cheaper properties. And so there's this really mixed community there now. So I live there, and I was just saying to Anika earlier too, you know, my brother and my sister-in-law that live in Ramsey, Minnesota, were like, do you feel safe there? You know, are you sure you want to live there? I've been in this neighborhood my entire life, and when I had the opportunity to buy a house, I decided to buy my house there. And I'm like, yeah, I think you experience more discrimination out in the suburbs than I do. I think I'm more safe here than you are out there, right? But one of the things I've noticed is that when I take the time to talk to my neighbors, when I just wave at my neighbors, it's like I literally see barriers breaking down. I see posture changing, you know, like getting to know my neighbors, just saying hi is so important, right? So recently I got a small grant to do a project working with 5 artists in 5 community gardens. So there are these spaces in my neighborhood where people are really taking care of the earth already and growing food together. And so we're doing these events, and I'm going out and I'm door knocking, and I'm talking to my neighbors and inviting them to come to these, what we're calling gatherings, right? And it's beautiful because, you know, last month I went up to one of my neighbors. His name is Emmett. He lives across the street. I met him for the first time. He was sitting on his stoop smoking a cigarette, and I started walking towards him, and he was like straightening his back, like he looked like he was preparing to talk to somebody really important, right? And I just went up to him and I introduced myself, said, hey, you know, I'm co-hosting this event down the street. He ended up bringing, like, he kept going back and forth. He brought like 10 of his family members and friends and like everybody, and he was just like, at the end of the day, he said, you know, people are usually scared to come and talk to me. And I'm so down for this movement. He started to call it a movement, right? He's like, I'm so down for this movement. And the next time you do anything like this, let me know and I'll bring my family out there. And so, you know, like this project is really about recognizing that this community is fractured for a number of different reasons. Historical trauma, racism, you know, we're not even talking to each other within the community itself. You know, people are busy and they're struggling. But it helps to talk to each other. It helps to create space where people can feel safe and where they can feel like they are in humanity with each other, right? And so it's, you know, I think the long-term kind of like the visionary piece of this like very simple project to bring people together in my neighborhood through art, food, and like shared space together and sharing stories is that this is one way for us to build power, right? In order for us to be able to do and make change in this neighborhood that a lot of people are not paying attention to, and the only attention they're paying to is the negativity, is for us to start sharing space and stories with each other, right? If we can share stories with each other, we can start agreeing on what are the assets in this community, what are the challenges that we want to agree on working towards together. So I don't know if I answered your question, but you know, I think that oftentimes we're so afraid of not talking to each other because we look different or because we are different, or we're just busy and stressed out and there's just a lot of things going on. But and that is a privilege I think that I recognize, right, for myself, is that you know, it's I always stop, I always pause whenever I say that, because as a Hmong American woman, in the larger scheme of things, it feels like a very powerless and privileged space to be in, but I have parents that really, really love me and that really have never given up on me and have given me all the things that I've ever needed to kind of feel pretty comfortable. But I think part of the responsibility of that, though, is to actually do something, right? And so I did feel powerless, and I did feel kind of frustrated and really concerned about my community, my neighborhood. And this was one little thing that I wanted to try to be able to do to just make connections.
That's a great story. Yeah, I love all the elements that were in there. One of the things that's really cool about storytelling, speaking as an anthropologist who works with what some people might refer to as anecdata, is that the reason why stories are cool, even though they're not, something aggregated and numbers-based and allows us to do, statistical analysis to come up with facts that we then use to convince people, stories can be pretty persuasive. And what they are these, like, rubber band balls where there's just so much stuff in a story, and then you can spend years unpacking one story and seeing what all the intersections are. So I want to tell a story about how I got here today, which was coming from North Minneapolis, where I stayed at a friend's house last night. And I knew I was going to be taking a bus to get on the Green Line light rail to come over here to St. Paul. And when I went out to wait for the bus, there was pretty much nobody around, not a lot of foot traffic on the street. Maybe one or two people walked past me. And so I thought, like, okay, I'm waiting like 15 minutes for the bus. I figured there probably wouldn't be a lot of people on that bus. As soon as the bus pulls up, a number of people came out of nowhere I hadn't even noticed were waiting to get on the bus, and that bus was packed, and it was full of Black people. So, okay, I'm a regular transit user. I'm a Latina woman. I'm extremely, attentive to who's around me, what are the spaces like that I'm in. So that's why I'm giving these details. So I get on the bus. I'm one of the only not Black people on the bus. I sit down, and I'm pretty good at kind of gauging what the feel of a transit space is like, whether people are happy to be there, whether people are like, here we go, another crowded bus ride where I'm gonna have to stand up because there's not even room for me. It was kind of more one of those bus rides. So, I'm like trying to make myself scarce. I've got my backpack and my shoulder bag, so I like cram into a seat, hold my stuff there, other people are standing up. And I overhear this conversation that gave me a lot of feelings, and I don't really know what to do with them, because it brought together a number of different things that are important to me. So there was this young man who there wasn't room for him to sit. He was standing to make room for other people. He was in that area that's at the back exit to a bus where there's, usually people stand there if the bus is too crowded. And someone who was sitting down, it turned out, had gone to high school with him. So they were kind of, comparing notes. They hadn't seen each other, it sounded like, in about a year. And this young man was like, yeah, and they were both Black. This young man was like, yeah, I thought I was going to go to college. I went for a while in Iowa, but, they were just like showing us TED Talks. And I was like, I could just watch this at home. I don't need to pay $500 a class. And so my first thought there was, oh, shit, he's on to us. Like, I'm a sometimes college instructor, and unfortunately, the state of higher education is not great right now. There is a hugely exploitative thing going on where fewer and fewer professors are actually full-time. Fewer and fewer professors are actually given the resources to dig in and make education their primary focus. It's piecemeal work. People are getting paid term to term to pop in, teach a class. They're not super prepared. They're showing TED Talks in class. That's true. That's going on. So I'm like, yeah, he's right about that. It's probably better for him not to be wasting his money in that way. But on the other hand, he needs to get that college education. So I'm thinking this stuff, listening. And then he goes on to talk about how, he doesn't need a college degree because all these billionaires, they don't have college degrees. And he figures he can just make money without school. And I'm like, yeah, fair enough. But then he talks about how when he was in high school, he was working so much, he often had to cut class. And it was so much that he ended up maybe only going like one day and then missing 2 days, going one day. So he was only going to class like 1 to 2 days a week. And he's like, but I graduated, so it's fine, right? And the other person was like, yeah. And then he got off the bus. And so what is that young man's life like with mobility? What is that young man's problems? What makes that young man unsafe? And how is he part of this whole world where he could run into somebody on the bus who's like, yeah, I know how it is. And then here I am, this person from outside of here who's just in town for one night with my fancy college degree and my you gotta go to school, at the same time that I'm aware that some of the amazing students I've been working with this year are DACA students, and they are potentially gonna get ripped out of the country that we live in. It felt very real. It felt very real, especially because I knew I was on my way to a conference that was gonna look really different than that bus did. And it does. It looks really different than that bus did. And, as someone who's motivated to be in these spaces, not just as a researcher, but as an activist and as someone who's committed to social change and transformation, I want us to be able to work together. I want us to be able to build visions for the future together so that we're not leaving each other out of the picture like we have so many times before. But I also just feel sometimes like I don't know how to make those connections. I don't know. How do I go from that bus to here? How do I do that? I mean, my feet take me. I walked. That's how I did it. Walking is this thing that connects so many different worlds and so many different spaces. But whose heads are we trying to get inside of when we're promoting walking? Whose preferences are we trying to match and come up with things that are going to get people on board? Are we trying to get inside that young man's head? Are we trying to get inside a politician's head? Are we trying to get inside of the head of someone who chooses to live in an exurban environment where they have to drive their SUV to the grocery store? Those are different heads. Those are really, really different heads. And there's something about my background that makes me very concerned when I feel like there are just these spaces that don't come up, even though they're there, and they're the ones who are there. I mean, in terms of sustainability and eco-friendly living, unfortunately, it's oppressed people who do that best. And unfortunately, they associate that lifestyle with oppression. It is absolutely true that so many people of color want to be driving cars, do not necessarily, envision biking and walking and using transit as a step up. That's changing, but it's changing in part because of gentrification. And if that's the best strategy we have, I think we need to go back to the drawing board, because I think that there's a way that we can work toward having these nice walkable spaces and these supportive environments and these culturally rich places where we can bring these different traditions together that doesn't count on all of us being rich, money-wise, in order to participate. And that's gonna mean we actually have to look at the roots of wealth inequality and how they tie into what our spaces are like, how we move around, how we connect to these different worlds. Because some of us are crossing between worlds all the time, and it's hard to know what to say or how to bring that information. So with a story, I have tried, ladies and gentlemen, and others, to illustrate that there's a lot of stuff that connects when you're talking about mobility and transportation environments.
Thanks, Adonia. Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a kind of more fair housing perspective, we talk about this notion of kind of inclusive gentrification, and that's actually a term. And it's essentially, the idea is, okay, there's going to be revitalization, there's going to be changes going on in a neighborhood. Let's just realize that. And how can we make sure that the benefits from those changes are inclusively shared among all the people who are there now, and how do we make sure that those people who are there now get to stay there? So one example, I think, managed gentrification, controlled gentrification, whatever you want to call it, that might be a way of sort of framing it, right? And so an example of a place that we sometimes point to is a small little neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, Wineland Park. It's adjacent to Ohio State University, and they undertook sort of concerted neighborhood planning process that was a revitalization plan, not a gentrification plan. And that involved a lot of direct, and it's, by the way, it's predominantly, I think, people of color, high, over 60% poverty rate, lots of vacant buildings, so it needed investment. And so there was an effort to undertake that sort of revitalization process. And the good thing about this, and one of the reasons why there's been success in kind of staving off the kind of worst forms of gentrification, is because there was citizen and resident participation in this planning process, both in its sort of formation, but also in its implementation. And it was explicitly based on the idea that, yeah, there had to be investment here, but it had to benefit the existing residents and not come at their expense, right? So pedestrian and bicycle environment was part of this, as well as sort of workforce development, as well as creating and preserving and retaining affordable housing in that neighborhood. Of course, the plan was sort of specific to the conditions that, pertain to this neighborhood, but those were a few of the plans that they undertook. So kind of conscious planning, including sort of citizen and residents in the planning process to sort of enable folks to stay and to benefit from the process of revitalization.
Thanks, Brian. Let's start to open it up to some questions from folks in the crowd. I can sense the post-lunch restlessness, and if you're like me, you might be like, oh, I'm really healthy, but I also need dessert or caffeine. But I'm at the walking summit, so just kidding. But let's try to deal with some of that and do questions. Our first question, go ahead.
Thank you, Tamika and everyone. I have a question that I've had for a long time here, but I think this panel brings it up. For context, I actually, for those of you who heard Glenn Harris this morning talk about Rainier Avenue in South Seattle, I grew up a block off of there. So it's it's an area where he talked about the street lighting. It was also an area as a kid that although I lived a block from there, we didn't go there. It was too dangerous, I think. Traffic, if you would have walked around there, you probably would have been hit by a car, and it's now been, in certain parts of it, the subject of a lot of revitalization. The light rail goes through it, and one of the areas definitely has experienced gentrification. But one of the things that, and displacement, I'd say, and it has to do with monetary. I think people have been forced out. I could not afford to live there anymore. I couldn't afford to buy a house, I should say. It is, Seattle's has an incredibly high housing market, but when you're talking about placemaking, and you're talking about whether you call it revitalization, gentrification, how much is there's the actual monetary displacement that happens. Taxes go up. Even if you're a homeowner, your property taxes go up. Your rent goes up. We convert apartments into condos. But in terms of a sense of place and a culture, as you go in and you bring amenities that we associate with gentrification, and not just bike lanes, but I'm thinking about types of restaurants, types of businesses, what becomes the types of food that are offered, how much do we have as a response? I guess the question is, I'm having a hard time articulating it, although I've been thinking about it a long time, is place is so much that culture that you really talked about, And when we think about bringing in amenities and how much of placemaking work fits into this idea of gentrification, because are we creating spaces and inclusive, what is an inclusive space when you're creating a space? Because I think about this neighborhood, it's called Columbia City in Seattle, and all the restaurants now are, they're pasty, but they're very high end. There's now an organic market there. It's very much like, and I'm not quite a millennial. I like to think I'm a little bit older, but I'm pretty much a millennial. But there are things that are geared towards me, the me of today, not the me of my childhood, and how placemaking kind of fits into the role of inclusionary, inclusionary revitalization. I would never say that we shouldn't have put investment in that neighborhood. There was nothing there. We didn't have access to healthy food unless we got in a car and drove 15 minutes. But with that, there's been a lot of displacement, and should people, and I've talked to many residents, and they've been able to, many people left because it no longer felt like home. Not only were they financially displaced, so I guess maybe this question is for you, as the placemaker, or anyone else who wants to fit in. And I know that was long and rambling, but thank you, because this has been sitting on my brain for a few years.
You got that, Kathy?
I think she was looking at me, but I'm not. I'm not sure if I have the exact answer for you. I mean, I'm thinking about different examples in the Twin Cities, and I think, Seattle, the rate of growth or gentrification and development there is way beyond where we're at right now. But I think that we are also very cautious of what is to come, right? So the Green Line was this huge billion-dollar development that came, that was really designed, it's been in the plans for the last 30 years to connect the two downtowns, right? And this came after the development of 94, so the community was really, aware of what this might mean in regards to how people might be displaced culturally and financially, economically. I'm interested in what land banks can do and land trusts can do, what different types of ownership models. I mean, some of the things that we're doing or we're working with our partners to do. So Asian Economic Development Association, also known as ADA, has developed a district in St. Paul called Little Mekong. And it's really, like I was saying earlier, there were all these properties along University Avenue. I remember growing up and driving down that street and feeling like danger, right? Like, this is a dangerous place to be in. The area has changed tremendously over the last 20 years or so. A lot of that is because these properties have been bought up and businesses. I mean, it's become a more thriving commercial corridor. So there's a concentration of about 80 businesses that are owned by Southeast Asian businesses. And when the news about the Green Line came in, I mean, those businesses, whether they talked to each other before or not, organized. They came together and they were like, we need to do something because we're going to lose business during construction. Who knows what's going to happen after construction, right? So they organized, and Asian Economic Development Association came out of that. When I started working with them 4 years ago, Vaming Tall, who was the executive director over there, was like, we're not an arts organization, right? We're an economic development organization. And was really skeptical about the role of arts and culture and what they were doing there. 4 years later, 30% of their organization is dedicated to creative placemaking. I think they've come to understand the power of artists and arts in their districts to really hold on and preserve that cultural identity, right? So they're still doing all the things that they can do to develop the businesses to make sure that they can handle new people that are coming, attracting new people too, right? There's this really fine line between wanting to attract new business, wanting to be authentic to the culture of that business, and being able to actually handle a huge influx of new customers. But we've gone from a time when it was just we're going to hire an artist to do commissioned one project, right? They're going to do something cool in a restaurant. We're going to attract new business. That's great, which is not sustainable for the business or the artists. 4 years later, they've they renovated a storefront. They are working with artists as businesses now to create more sustainability for those businesses. They're working with artists to learn how to price, package, and sell their work in a retail space. I mean, I think so. and that I think is really, it's community driven. It's thinking about who is there, what are the needs of the community, and not just kind of like pimping out like, artists to do these one-time things to make this place really cool, but to really think about what is the sustainability of these artists. And this is, and this, again, is not, these are not artists that are necessarily going to school or have MFAs, or this is not necessarily fine art artists. These are artists from the community, right? We believe that there's an artist on every single block in every single community. There are probably several artists in this room. Whether you do it professionally or not, yes, Anna. But how do you really build off that? Now, the property taxes and like there's policy. I think what we haven't figured out is how do we put this into policy, right? There was a really smart project in St. Paul called Irrigate, which was working with artists. We trained hundreds of artists. This was a partnership between Springboard for the Arts, City of St. Paul, and Twin Cities LISC to do many small projects along the Green Line during construction, right? So during a time when people are like wanting to stay away from this corridor, this was a reason for them to go to that corridor, right? We found that there were 50 million positive social media impressions after this project happened. For many businesses, this kept their businesses alive. So if you were an artist, you could go through a training and then you would be eligible for a $1,000 grant, right? So these were small projects. So if you think about usually public art projects, it's $30,000 for one statue that the entire community will argue about, right? If you could stretch that $30,000 over 30 different artists and 30 different projects, have a number of different voices. It's also, it was also designed so that if businesses, there were a couple of requirements. You had to either partner with a business or the district council. You had to be either living in the neighborhood, working in the neighborhood, or have like a significant relationship with the neighborhood. So this wasn't about like, parachuting folks into a neighborhood and having them do something cool there. But these were also, $1,000. If something really worked, like a business could actually replicate this, right? This wasn't going to break their bank. So it was an amazing project. It's a powerful tool that we're like, why isn't this being put into policy? Why isn't this something that we have as a requirement for every, light rail project? And so that's one of the things that we haven't quite figured out yet. But I think, exploring different ownership models, whether that be community co-ops or land banks or, I don't know, yeah. Those are just some of the initial things that came to mind in regards to like how are we doing, making things more sustainable for businesses, for artists, how do we preserve culture in communities? I think, if you're not already working with artists in your community, I really encourage you to start thinking more creatively about the things that you're already doing.
Other questions? And then I know after this one we have one in the back.
John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. I spent a couple days in Milwaukee on the way up here and was talking with pedestrian advocates there. We're dealing with equity issues in terms of neighborhoods with minority populations, low income, tend to have higher pedestrian fatality rates, but they have equity concerns in terms of traffic enforcement, that if they try to increase traffic enforcement, that also has a major equity impact. So beyond just fixing sidewalks and adding street trees, there's a real concern with equity impacts of enforcement or non-enforcement. Where does that fit into all this?
That's a really good question. So this is, and cities who have declared themselves Vision Zero cities. Raise your hand if you live in a Vision Zero city. So keep your hand up if you're dealing with this issue in your Vision Zero city. So not as many people. And by dealing with, you might be trying, but I'm guessing you're not as successful. So raise your hand if you're successful at dealing with enforcement in a Vision Zero city. So yeah, I think this is a question that comes up a lot. How do advocates do work when, everyone's gonna support zero death? Like, that's a winner. But we keep having this problem with, if you have to make Vision Zero or any type of pedestrian safety initiative work by increasing enforcement, there are people who are pushing back on that. And then I'll add this other layer that there's people who are pushing back on those people and saying, this isn't about enforcement, why are you distracting from the issue? And I know this is something that's really been a problem in LA, where those of us who have spoken out against increasing enforcement of any type have been told that we're not true advocates, that we really don't care about pedestrians, that we don't want to save lives. A council member right now has a PAC that has been formed to try to have a special election to vote him out. He gets calls to his office that are racist. Walking and advocates in LA have been sent letters to their personal home addresses with people saying things like, don't transgender my driving lane. And the only people who bike and walk are Mexicans or whatever it may be. And so for me, it's always been really curious how people, mainly white people, mainly white dudes, can say this isn't about enforcement, but then the very people who are kind of pushing against you are using racist, transphobic. I won't even say undertones. I'd say they're overtones. And so, how do you deal with this enforcement safety struggle?
I mean, one major issue with enforcement as a tool is that what does public safety mean? If you look at our country, which since the post-World War II era has preferred spatial distance in how we live, has preferred, racial segregation goes way further back than that, but has perpetuated racial segregation in how we live. We get safe by getting isolated. You're alone in your McMansion, on the cul-de-sac, nobody else is around, you're in your bonus room, like that's safe, and you've got the panic room you can get into if you need to, because they're coming for you, these like security fantasies we have, I don't think it's healthy. I'll just say that. I don't think it's healthy, this really strong impulse that we're battling out in our country right now, that some people want to be as isolated as possible. I don't think it's healthy. But that impulse is there, and it's in how we police our public spaces. So to make spaces safer, historically, we've simply you remove the people who are making it unsafe. Well, some of those people who've been getting removed are starting to push back pretty hard and say, wait, what? Whose safety are we talking about here? If safe means, every male relative I have has spent time in jail, is that safe? Are they safe? If safe means that my child going to school may get picked up by ICE, is that safe? Am I safe? Is my child safe? What does safety mean? And I think that it's, that needs to be grappled with. It really does need to be grappled with, because obviously, the way that we do policing in this country is not going to change overnight. The fact that police departments are part of traffic safety is not going to change or go away overnight. We really need to, from my perspective, be a lot more probing with what it is we mean by safe. And if we want to create safety for all, that actually means something pretty big and pretty different. It means expanding out, who's going to be included in that protection, all the way to, prison abolition, all the way to actually getting rid of these borders that say, if you're on this side and you were born here or your parents were born here, you're safe. But if you're on that side, you don't deserve to have the protections that we have on this side. For a lot of us, those divides are painful, and they feel arbitrary. And, so again, from my perspective, if we want to really look at enforcement, we have to dig deep into what safety means and let the people who usually don't get to be safe be the ones leading the way and defining it.
I think I'll just add, I think something I think Kathy said earlier was we have to also look at root causes. Like we have to really go back, and I think sometimes that's really overwhelming for folks because no one likes to say like, you know, you can't have a Vision Zero strategy or a street safety strategy that prioritizes police enforcement because of white supremacy. Like everyone's just like, well then what do we do? But just so we're clear, you can't have a Vision Zero strategy or street safety strategy that prioritizes enforcement because of white supremacy. And because we live in a culture in which, you know, the most unsafe I ever feel is in a group full of white people telling me I look handsome and trying to fill my hair. Like, it's just like I don't even know what to do. Or on a new train line that goes through my black neighborhood, but now takes you to the beach. So now all of a sudden white people want to be on the train, and like that train that feels so unsafe to other people when it used to just go through the hood, but was like hella chill for me, all of a sudden feels really unsafe because there's all of these white folks, and if one of them says that I've done something wrong, my life could be over just because I looked at them the wrong way. Or just because I look like someone else, because we all look alike. And so it's really tough to not be able to talk about those deeper root issues and to own them and to name them. For folks who say, I don't understand how people could be against increased enforcement, because if someone's speeding, we should write them a ticket and we should make it so expensive that they don't want to do it again, then you're ignoring the fact that the person who gets that ticket might be a single mom or a single dad struggling to make it, and that might be the difference between putting food on the table or not. And not because they're lazy and not because they don't work hard, but because they've been segregated in a neighborhood that was divided by the freeway on intentional policies around segregation and keeping people of color away from resources and away from power. And so if you come into a community and you're not willing to own that, you're just saying, but don't worry, your friendly officer is going to be here. That's not a friendly officer to us. When they say they're there to serve and protect, not me. And so if you're not able to have those conversations and grapple with those conversations, then you can have the best marketing strategy you've ever imagined on Vision Zero, and all your politicians can get together and take pictures and make it the best celebration, but you're gonna have a group of people who don't feel safe, for whom safety looks different to them, and who inherently go into the situation and say, this was never built for me. And you might have, like we've heard about in Portland, you might have a white parent who's like, I literally don't care about the race of the person who killed my child. Like, I don't. I just don't want them speeding and killing any more people's children. And that's also fair, and that's also valid. And you have to make space to hold that and to feel those feelings. But her pain isn't different than the pain black mothers have every single morning, that undocumented moms have every single morning when they wake up and they don't know if their kid's gonna come home. When black moms teach their kids, when you're on public transit, take a book and pretend to read so people think you're smart and don't bother you. If you can't have a conversation about why they have to do that, in the same way you can have a conversation with victims' families about what they've had to go through and what they experience, then you're not doing your best work as an advocate, and you'll never get to zero. We had a question in the back.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all for traveling here to provide your perspective today. I hope everybody else has found this as good as I have. So there's been some frank, and I love it, dialogue on the panel about the demographics in this room, and frankly, the Walking Summit Twitter feed is blowing up about it too right now. So I guess if the people that put this conference together, America Walks, are listening, or the folks that are in leadership roles in this room are listening, what would the panel suggest to maybe go about changing the demographics in this room? I have some thoughts on it, but while I don't have any power to give you, I'm going to sit down, shut up, and listen.
I'm going to keep talking. You guys can tell me when I've said enough. I think that by no means the demographics of this room are like solely based on the actions of America Walks. Like, I want to be clear about that. There's not one organization that has the power to really, create who feels comfortable in this movement and who doesn't. I worked on an equity initiative at the League of American Bicyclists for about 18 months from 2013 to 2015. And, one of the very ambitious things we were trying to do there was something like that. Like, okay, we're going to transform this organization, and then that's going to transform the movement. And I had just finished my PhD, so I thought that was possible. It's like, well, if you're going to do it, it's going to take more than 18 months. I can tell you that much. And you're going to need like a team of superheroes who like trust each other like crazy and, have been working together for years if they're going to strategize something like that. So anyway, all of which is to say, America Walks, this is not some sort of like, you guys, blah. This has been an extremely successful conference, and I want to congratulate you again on what an amazing turnout you've had with the growth of this movement. I do think you guys should be clapping. There are so many factors at play in why our movement spaces look the way they do. And I think that it's worth talking about, it's worth strategizing around, and I think that's great work that America Walks and other organizations in the walking movement can take on. What is the movement that we want to be part of? What is the movement that we want other people to see themselves reflected in? What are the issues that are going to connect with the realities that people are facing? The weird pretzel thing I've been trying to do since I moved back to Southern California after learning that you actually can't transform a movement through one organization at the national level in bicycle advocacy was, when I lived in LA during my field work, I was car-free, really, really attached to that identity. I hated it when people offered me rides. It was like, no, you're trying to imply that I can't, get there on my own. I can do it. And when I moved back, somehow, I was going through like a soul-searching phase, and I wanted to feel connected to my younger self and this region that is a huge part of my identity. My family's been in Southern California since the 1890s, and really care very deeply about that place. And guess what? That meant I started driving a lot more, because that is where my people are at. They're behind their steering wheels. And I gotta tell you guys, I cry like pretty much every time I drive. I'm a very easy crier, I cry so easily. But like, I get in the car, I put on Spotify, like I'm listening to my rock en español or some, pop from the past, and I'm just like, sitting on the 101 in traffic, because I'm stuck there. That's where we are. That's where we are. We are where we are, which is people feel way safer in their cars. And we can show them numbers till we're blue in the face about how that's not true. That's where we're at. And so I'm really interested in figuring out, how do we stay rooted in our movements, and the values that we have, while also connecting with those people who are behind the wheels of their cars. And so I'm really interested in figuring that out. And I don't have answers yet, but I do have a Prius that is helping me look for those answers. So it's about as much as I can offer.
Yeah, I completely agree. Earlier when I was talking about, I've been thinking a lot about like where's my space in this space, right? So not necessarily being a walking advocate, and but it's been really clear to me since the beginning, since I got here this morning, and that the morning plenary and everything that Tamika has been talking about, and this panel, right? I think this panel is definitely a good start. This like equity, social justice, like all of these things these are not transactional like happenings, right? Everything is very relational. And I wouldn't put all the responsibility on Walk America either. I think that everybody in this room, you know, if you care, like these are relationships. You know, one of the questions that we were asked to answer, to think about, was research and data. And, you know, sitting, I think, between two researchers. You know, I think research and data is so important. It's such a powerful tool, but research and data alone is not the solution. Right? I've sat in rooms with people where I am one of very few people of color, and when we're talking about racial equity, and everything is being talked about through data. And I'm sitting here and I'm looking around and I'm like, do any of you know people of color? Like, do you have relationships with people? Like, you're making decisions on behalf of people of color, for people of color, you know, and like, you're acting like you don't know anybody. Like, you know, and so, I mean, I think, and this, I'm not assuming that you don't know people of color, but you know, this is really relational work. I hope that, you know, I've never been to a walking summit before. I hope that this is not like the end of this conversation and the last time that there's a panel up here talking about these issues. You know, I was so inspired this morning with the morning plenary and just, you know, hearing about, you know, walking, rolling, and possibilities, right? And just really thinking about walkability in a different way. So, you know, I would not put the responsibility solely on this summit. If you really want to, you have to be a part of it, right? Start building relationships. And to your point too, right? The Hmong community, if there are 5 driving people of age that can drive in a household, you will see 5 cars outside of their home, right? It's for a very long time been a sign of success and wealth and prosperity to own a car. So I'm with you. I think that, you know, how many people here are walking advocates? Can I just see? Okay, yeah. So like you have a summit room full of people, walking advocates. I mean, that's not a surprise, but it's like, we need a better mix of people, right? You're talking to each other. This is true in the API community. I just came back from a national Asian Pacific Islander, you know. I mean, we just, oftentimes we just get siloed and we talk to each other. So I would just encourage you to just keep building those relationships and not ending it here.
Yeah, just real quickly, I'm pretty new to the civil rights movement. I've been working at PRAC for about a little over a year. And so, and I'm a white person working in a civil rights organization, and PRAC is actually a white-led civil rights organization, which is there's some awkwardness from that point, right? And the stance that I've taken is just to listen and to, you know, just assume that I don't know very much about it, and to be as humble as I can, and to sort of, you know, contribute where I can, but to do a lot of listening. And this sort of came to the forefront right after I started. Just a quick anecdote there was a big conference at our office of national, it was about a grant program, and all of these sort of executive directors of sort of the most well-known civil rights organizations were sitting around the table, and it was right after a lot of the police shootings last summer, and I had been there about a week, and everybody was going around the table and was, you know, like, okay, each person was going to share something about how they were feeling about this, and I was sort of terrified of what I was going to say, but it was just, it was fascinating and important for me, I think, to just hear what everyone else was saying and to experience the pain that they were feeling and to sort of grasp that firsthand. And hopefully I said something that was sensitive to the moment. But I think that's, you know, that would be for me, is sort of listening, hearing, being attuned to what folks are saying. And so, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. I don't know where the mics are. I saw her hand first, sorry.
It's actually just a follow-up to your question and your opening remarks. It's a follow-up to this discussion. You said in terms of changing the demographic in the room,
of changing the demographic in the room, that we should shut up and move aside white people. Would you just talk a little bit more about that, what you mean? I think that was in regard to changing the demographic, right?
Well, I think it's to Brian's point, actually. I think it's not that you always shut up, because I think you have to realize that, as we've said, as folks of color, sometimes you're the only person of color in the room, and people are saying problematic shit, and you have white allies who know it's problematic, and they just look at you like, Kathy, what you gonna do? This isn't my space to speak up. Kathy, come on. And so I think in those types of situations, the answer is not to shut up and do nothing. I think it's being nuanced. It's knowing when to step up and step back. So to what I said about Amelia earlier from LA, I would say ask her, because she's really good at that. She knows exactly, and she's not always right, but she's always willing to try. And she knows when it's important to say, you know what, I'm not really gonna speak to this issue, but I'm gonna elevate the other community groups who don't get invited to this meeting because they're not at the Los Angeles, Walks organization. They're at a small nonprofit in their community doing the work every day, but they didn't even know there was gonna be a meeting. So I'm going to make sure I invite them and that they speak at the meeting. And then she also knows when, people are looking at them and being like, people of color, how do I fix it? I have feelings. I'm so sad. And Amelia knows when she has to step up and say, why are you asking Tamika? Did you read anything before you got here? Did you do any work on your own? And so I think it's knowing when to go back and forth. And just like the other panelists said, and especially Brian, it's knowing when to sit in your discomfort and be okay with it. It's not embarrassing to be freaked out when everybody's going around and you're the white person in the room and you're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, I'm not racist. What do I say? I'm not racist, I'm not racist, I'm not racist. That's okay, but how do you move past that? And I too think that, America Walks has done a really great job. In particular, I think Heidi has been fantastic. But I also think, and not a but, it's an and, I also think, everyone here has a role to play. It's not just them. You all are coming from places where there are people doing work. They might not have known about the conference. Did you tell them about the conference? If they said they couldn't afford it, but your organization could afford to send you, did you talk to them about fundraising to get them here? Did anybody reach out to America Walks and say, this is really expensive, but we have some really good grassroots advocates in our community, what can we do? So it's not just the organizers, what can we all do every day to really elevate other people? And then if those folks aren't here, how do you make sure that this isn't just the opening with Glenn and then us this afternoon? What's on next year's agenda? How are we already building off of this? And if money is really the barrier, then what systems are we creating for folks to be able to get to a conference at the Intercontinental that overlooks the river, which someone told me was the Mississippi, and and enjoy all that entails? And so we each have a role to play. There are many things America Walks can do. There are many things they are doing. Charles Brown on their board has put together this awesome webinar that is gonna happen where we're speaking about segregation. And so, they're trying to walk the walk, but who else is on the board? Who else is in the rooms? And are we tokenizing folks of color? And again, looking at them and expecting them to be the ones who speak up and do the work? Are we bringing them to the conversation, making them feel welcome? And the last thing I'll say is, you asked, young man, how do we get more of those folks in the room? We might have to start by acknowledging that this isn't the right fucking room. And there might be places where people of color are already meeting and already doing the work. And do we start giving them the money and supporting them with our resources to say, y'all already got a bomb conference, so let's elevate that. We're gonna go to your room. We're gonna get interpreters in English. We're gonna learn how to do things the way you do things instead of expecting you to come to us. Because simply by saying you should come to us is an exhibit of power and privilege and colonization. And so we have to say, is this the right room?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Glenn Harris told us this morning that there were 1 million possibilities and that we were only looking at a small sliver of them. I believe what we got this afternoon or for lunch was a look at some of those other possibilities, which are fabulous, and we want to thank our panelists for their honest, candid discussion with us. That's what we wanted. We are not disappointed. A round of applause, please. All right. Okay. You guys can, right.